Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper, where forgotten civilizations, unexplained wonders, and ancient secrets come back to life. Ready to unravel the mystery? Let's begin the journey. Legends of giants are found in almost every culture, but most are dismissed as myth. In the Nevada desert, however, an ancient story told by the Paiute people seems to crash into reality. They spoke of a war against a tribe of red-haired, cannibalistic giants. Then, in a dusty cave, archaeologists found unusual remains. Is this where an ancient legend becomes historical fact? Before any lines were drawn on a map, before the first prospectors arrived searching for gold and silver, before the land was even named Nevada, it was a different world. It was a vast, silent expanse of sagebrush desert, dramatic mountain ranges, and the shimmering remnants of an immense ancient lake. This was the ancestral home of the Paiute people, a resilient and deeply spiritual community that has lived in the harsh beauty of the Great Basin for thousands of years. And like all ancient cultures, their history is not just written in books. It is woven into the landscape itself, carried across generations in the form of sacred oral traditions. These stories tell of their origins, their travels, and their struggles. And among the most powerful and disturbing of these traditions is a story that has been passed down from elder to child for countless generations, a story of a brutal, ancient war against an enemy that was not entirely human. It is the legend of the Cetacea, a fearsome race of red-haired, cannibalistic giants. The story, as told by Paiute elders and recorded by early ethnographers, begins in the distant past, in a time so ancient it is known only as the time of the ancestors. When the first bands of Paiute people migrated into the land surrounding what is now the Humboldt Sink, they did not find an empty wilderness. The land was already occupied. From the shores of the vast, ancient Lake Lahontan to the caves that dotted the surrounding mountains, there lived a race of people who were taller, stronger, and far more ferocious than any they had ever encountered. The Paiute called them the Cetacea. The name itself offers a clue to their way of life. It translates literally to tule eaters. The tule is a tough, fibrous bulrush that grows in dense thickets around the marshy edges of lakes and rivers. According to the legend, the Cetacea were masters of weaving this plant. They used it to build massive, sturdy rafts, which they navigated across the deep waters of the lake, allowing them to travel between the islands and shorelines with ease. They were a water people, at home in the vast network of wetlands that once covered the region. But their most startling and unforgettable physical feature, the one that is mentioned in every telling of the legend, was their hair. It was not black like that of the Paiute and other native peoples of the region. It was a bright fiery red. Some versions of the story describe it as a sandy, reddish blonde, while others speak of a deep auburn, like the color of dried blood. This strange and alien feature immediately set them apart, marking them as outsiders, as something other. And their nature, the Paiute soon learned, was as harsh and unforgiving as their appearance was strange. They were not a peaceful people. The Cetacea were described as incredibly aggressive, territorial, and warlike. But their most horrifying characteristic was their diet. The Paiute elders spoke in hushed, serious tones of the Cetacea's cannibalism. They were man-eaters. They did not just kill their enemies in battle. They consumed them. They would hunt the Paiute people, carrying them off to their cave lairs to be devoured. For the early Paiute settlers, the Cetacea were not just rivals for territory. They were monstrous predators, a constant terrifying threat that haunted the landscape. The physical descriptions of these giants are a cornerstone of the legend. While oral traditions can sometimes be fluid with exact numbers, the consistent theme is one of immense size and strength. The Cetacea were said to be giants, towering over the Paiute people. Their height made them formidable warriors, capable of wielding massive clubs and throwing heavy stones with deadly accuracy. Their settlements were crude, often based in the large, defensible caves that provided natural fortresses against the elements and their enemies. They were a people of brute force, their culture seemingly devoid of the intricate artistry and spiritual philosophy that defined the Paiute. They were a primal, terrifying force of nature that the Paiute ancestors had to confront in order to survive. The stage was set for a conflict that would last for generations, a war not just for land, but for the very existence of the Paiute people in their new home. The conflict between the Paiute and the Cth was not a single decisive battle, but a long grinding war of attrition that stretched over many lifetimes. The legend does not speak of years, but of generations of struggle, of a dark and bloody period in the history of the ancestors. It was a time of constant fear and vigilance. Paiute hunting parties would have to move with extreme caution, always on the lookout for the towering red-haired figures of their enemies. Children would be warned not to stray too far from the safety of the camps, their minds filled with terrifying stories of the cannibal giants who lived in the mountains. Every strange noise in the night, every shadow that seemed too tall, would have brought a jolt of fear. This was a guerrilla war, fought in the rugged terrain of the Great Basin in the narrow canyons, across the vast, open salt flats, and along the marshy shores of the lake. In the beginning, the Paiute were at a severe disadvantage. The Cth were larger, stronger, and deeply entrenched in the land. They knew the best hunting grounds, the most defensible caves, and the hidden waterways of the Great Lake. The Paiute bands, being smaller and more scattered, were often picked off one by one. A lone family, a small hunting party, a camp caught unawares. These were the tragic, everyday events of the long war. The Cth's cannibalism added a layer of psychological terror to the conflict. To be killed by an enemy was one thing. To be hunted like an animal and then eaten was a horror that went beyond the normal scope of warfare. It transformed the Cth from mere human adversaries into monsters, into something that had to be exterminated for the world to be safe. This constant, existential threat forced a profound change within Paiute society. The various independent bands, who had traditionally operated on their own, realized they could not survive this war alone. The elders and chiefs of the different tribes began to meet in secret councils. They understood that their only hope for victory lay in unity. They had to put aside their own rivalries and territorial disputes and form a grand alliance, a united front against the Cth. This decision marked a turning point in the war. The Paiute, though smaller in stature, had numbers, ingenuity, and a burning desire to protect their families and their way of life. They were skilled hunters and trackers, and they began to use their knowledge of the land to their advantage. They set ambushes, conducted raids on the giants' camps, and began to systematically disrupt their food supplies. The war was fought with the brutal, primitive weapons of the time. The Paiute were masters of the bow and arrow, their obsidian-tipped arrows capable of piercing the thick hides and tough muscles of their giant foes. The Cth, in turn, fought with heavy stone-headed clubs and spears, relying on their immense physical strength to crush their smaller opponents. The legends speak of epic skirmishes, of brave Paiute warriors luring the giants into narrow passes where their size became a disadvantage, of desperate struggles where the fate of a tribe would hang in the balance. The war was slow, and the cost in lives was immense on both sides. But the strategy of the Paiute alliance began to work. Slowly, methodically, the number of the Cth began to dwindle. The once dominant race was being pushed back, hunted, and driven to the brink of extinction. Their territory shrank, their numbers thinned, and they were forced to retreat to their most defensible strongholds. The long, dark night of the war was finally approaching its dawn, a dawn that would be lit by the fires of a final, terrible confrontation. The generations of bitter conflict finally culminated in a last, desperate stand. The remaining Cth, their numbers now catastrophically reduced, were driven from their scattered camps and forced to consolidate into a single final refuge. This last bastion was a large, deep cave overlooking the Humboldt Sink, a place that offered a commanding view of the surrounding territory and a seemingly impregnable natural defense. Today we know this place as Lovelock Cave. For the last of the red-haired giants, it was their Alamo, their Masada, the last place on earth where they could fight for their survival. They gathered their remaining warriors, their women, and their children, and retreated into the dark, cavernous depths of their final fortress, preparing to weather the storm they knew was coming. The Grand Alliance of the Paiute tribes, having finally cornered their ancient enemy, converged on the cave. Warriors from all the united bands surrounded the mountain, blocking every possible escape route. The Paiute chiefs called out to the giants, demanding their surrender. They offered them a chance to come out and face justice for their generations of cannibalism and warfare. But the Sitage, proud and ferocious to the end, refused. They hurled insults and threats from the mouth of the cave, choosing to die in their stronghold rather than submit to their hated enemies. The standoff was tense. The Paiute warriors were eager for a final battle, but they knew that a direct assault on the cave would be suicidal. The narrow entrance would create a deadly bottleneck, allowing a few giant warriors to hold off a much larger force, inflicting massive casualties. The Paiute chiefs needed a different strategy, a way to defeat their enemy without sacrificing countless more of their own people. After a tense council of war, a grim and terrible plan was devised. They would use the cave itself as a tomb. They would fight their enemy not with arrows and spears but with fire. The Paiute warriors fanned out across the landscape, gathering every dry piece of brush, every dead sage bush, every fallen branch they could find. They worked for hours, piling the fuel high at the mouth of the cave, creating a massive, dense barrier of highly flammable material. The Sitage, trapped inside, could only watch as their enemies sealed their fate. They were now entombed, with only one way out, and that way was about to become an inferno. When the pile of brush was as high as a man, the Paiute shamans performed the final rituals, and the chiefs gave the order. Torches were lit and thrust into the dry tinder. The fire caught quickly, crackling to life before roaring into a massive wall of flame. Thick, acrid smoke billowed into the mouth of the cave, choking the air within. The heat became unbearable. The choice for the giants was now stark and immediate. They could stay inside and suffocate and burn, or they could make a desperate charge through the flames and face the army of warriors waiting for them outside. A few of the giants, driven mad by the smoke and heat, chose the latter. They burst from the fiery entrance, their red hair singed, their skin blistered, roaring in fury and agony. But they were met with the storm of arrows. The Paiute warriors, positioned in a semicircle around the cave mouth, unleashed volley after volley. Each giant that emerged was pierced by dozens of arrows, falling to the ground before they could even reach the Paiute lines. The legend is clear. Not a single one who fled the cave survived. The rest of the Sitage remained inside, their defiant roars slowly turning to screams of agony before finally falling silent. The Paiute warriors kept the fire burning for hours, ensuring that no one within could possibly survive. They stood and listened until the only sound was the crackling of the great fire and the wind blowing across the desert. When the fire finally died down, the entrance to the cave was a smoking, charred ruin. The war was over. The ancient enemy that had plagued their ancestors for generations was finally and utterly destroyed. The Paiute people were now the undisputed masters of the land. The story of this final battle at the cave became a sacred and cautionary tale, a cornerstone of their oral history. It was a story of their people's courage, their unity, and their ultimate triumph over a monstrous evil. The cave itself became a powerful taboo place, the tomb of the giants, a site associated with death and ancient conflict. And for centuries, the story remained just a story, a vivid piece of local folklore, a myth told around campfires under the vast, starry sky of the Nevada desert. But what if it wasn't just a myth? What if the Paiute tradition was not a metaphor, but a literal historical account? What if the cave held physical proof of this epic ancient war? This is the question that would hang in the air for centuries, waiting for the day when the modern world would stumble upon the giant's tomb, and the legend of the Cth would collide head-on with the verifiable facts of archaeology. For countless generations, the Paiute legend of the Cth remained what it was: a powerful oral tradition, a story etched into the memory of a people and the landscape of the Great Basin. The tale of the final fiery battle at the cave served as a sacred history and a cautionary tale, a monument built of words. The cave itself, a dark mouth in the side of a lonely desert mountain, was a place of reverence and taboo, the known tomb of the vanquished giants. To the outside world, it was just another geological feature in a vast and empty wilderness. But in the early 20th century, the relentless expansion of the modern world would finally breach this ancient sanctuary. The age of myth was about to collide with the age of industry, and what began as a mundane commercial enterprise would quickly evolve into one of the most significant and controversial archaeological discoveries in North American history. The Tomb of the Giants was about to be opened. The story of the cave's rediscovery does not begin with intrepid archaeologists searching for a lost race, but with two miners driven by a much more practical and pungent motive: fertilizer. The year was 1911. The cave, which would soon be known to the world as Lovelock Cave, was known locally as the Bat Cave. And where there are bats, there is guano. Over thousands of years, untold generations of bats had roosted in the deep, dark recesses of the cave, depositing a thick, rich layer of droppings on the cave floor. In the early 20th century, before the advent of chemical fertilizers, bat guano was a highly prized commodity. Rich in nitrates, it was a potent natural fertilizer, and there was a booming market for it. Two miners, David Pugh and James Hart, secured the rights to excavate the guano from the cave. For them, the cave was not a sacred tomb. It was a potential gold mine of brown gold. They set up a camp near the cave and began the back-breaking work of digging. The guano layer was immense, in some places 4 to 6 feet deep, compacted over the millennia into a dense, dry mass. As they shoveled the guano into sacks, breaking it up with picks and shovels, they immediately started to find things. Not rocks or bones of bats, but man-made objects. At first, they were just curiosities: strange woven fragments, pieces of rope, and unusually shaped sticks. But as they dug deeper, the objects became more numerous and more complex. They unearthed intricately woven baskets, some so well preserved they looked as if they had been made only yesterday. They found sandals made of plant fibers, fishing nets, and tools carved from bone and stone. It quickly became clear that this was not just a bat cave. It was an ancient human habitation site of incredible richness. Pugh and Hart were miners, not scientists. Their primary goal was to extract the valuable guano, and the artifacts were, for the most part, an inconvenience. They were an obstacle to be cleared away. According to later accounts, countless priceless objects were simply tossed aside, thrown onto a discard pile outside the cave, or even burned as firewood to keep the miners warm during the cold desert nights. The scale of this initial, unscientific disturbance is heartbreaking for modern archaeologists to contemplate. An unknown volume of historical data was lost forever. But the miners were not completely oblivious to the significance of their finds. They recognized that some of the objects were unique, and they began to set aside the more impressive pieces. It was during this crude excavation that the first hints of something truly strange emerged. As they dug through the layers of guano and ancient debris, they began to unearth human remains. This was not entirely surprising, as ancient peoples often buried their dead in caves. But the miners were struck by the size of some of the skeletons. They were, by their estimation, unusually tall. They also found what seemed to be clumps of human hair, and were startled to find that much of it was not the expected jet black, but a distinct reddish-brown. The stories they would later tell, peppered with the casual exaggeration common among frontiersmen, would form the first modern seeds of the Lovelock giant legend. They spoke of finding jawbones so large they could fit one over their own jaw, and femurs that were unervingly long. They were unearthing evidence that seemed to align, in a chilling way, with the old Paiute legends that still circulated in the region. But for now, it was just a strange aside to their main business of digging up fertilizer. They had no idea that their commercial venture was about to attract the attention of the academic world. Word of the strange finds at the Guano Cave eventually began to trickle out of the remote Nevada desert. By 1912, these rumors had reached the ears of the anthropology department at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the premier institutions for the study of Native American history on the West Coast. The university recognized that a site of potentially immense archaeological importance was being actively destroyed. They needed to send someone to investigate, and quickly. The man chosen for the job was an archaeologist by the name of Llewellyn L. Loud. Loud was not a seasoned, famous archaeologist at the time. He was more of a museum assistant and field collector. But he was diligent and methodical, and he was tasked with the salvage operation, to go to Lovelock Cave and recover whatever he could before it was all lost to the guano shovels. When Loud arrived at the cave, he was met with a scene of controlled chaos. The miners were still actively digging, and a large portion of the cave floor had already been cleared out. A massive pile of discarded artifacts lay near the cave entrance, exposed to the elements. Loud immediately understood the urgency of his mission. He spent 5 months at the site, from April to August of 1912. He didn't conduct a full-scale, grid-based excavation in the modern sense. His primary job was to sift through the material the miners had already dug up and to carefully excavate the remaining undisturbed sections of the cave. The sheer volume of what he found was staggering. He collected and cataloged over 10,000 individual specimens. The preservation of the artifacts was almost miraculous. The incredibly dry, arid climate of the cave, combined with the protective layers of sterile guano, had created a perfect time capsule. Organic materials that would have rotted away anywhere else had survived for thousands of years in pristine condition. Loud unearthed delicate fishing nets made of plant fiber, complete with stone weights. He found clothing woven from reeds and animal hides. He discovered one of the most famous and remarkable finds from the cave. A collection of 11 duck decoys, masterfully crafted from tule reeds, covered in feathers, and painted to look incredibly lifelike. These decoys, later dated to be over 2,000 years old, are considered masterpieces of prehistoric art. He found knives with obsidian blades still hafted to their wooden handles, and arrows with their feathers and sinew bindings still intact. He was uncovering a detailed, intimate portrait of the people who had used this cave as a home, a workshop, and a sacred place for millennia. Loud's meticulous work confirmed that the cave had been occupied over a very long period, with different cultures leaving their mark in distinct layers or strata. He found evidence of a progression of technologies and lifestyles, a rich and complex history buried in the cave floor. In his published report, Ethnogeography and Archaeology of the Wiyot Territory, he detailed his findings with scientific precision. He also recorded his interactions with the local Paiute people, and was one of the first academics to officially document their oral tradition of the red-haired giants and the final battle at the cave. Loud noted the striking correlation between the legend and the setting, but as a scientist, he was cautious. His official report focused on the tangible artifacts and the cultural sequencing of the site. However, he did note the discovery of human remains, including several mummified bodies, and made observations about their physical characteristics, which kept the door to the giant mystery slightly ajar. His work had saved Lovelock Cave from total destruction and established it as one of the most important archaeological sites in the Great Basin. But the story was far from over. The richness of Loud's initial findings prompted a more thorough and systematic investigation a decade later. In the summer of 1924, the University of California sent a second, more experienced team to Lovelock Cave. This expedition was led by Mark R. Harrington, an archaeologist from the Museum of the American Indian. Harrington's goal was to build on Loud's work, to excavate the remaining undisturbed areas with more modern techniques, and to try to create a clearer timeline of the cave's occupation. He was accompanied by local Paiute men who served as guides and laborers, and whose presence brought the ancient legends directly into the scientific process. One of these men, a Paiute named John T. Reed, would later write his own account, providing a valuable perspective that blended the scientific findings with the traditional oral history. Harrington's team excavated a large trench in the cave, carefully documenting the different layers of occupation. Their work confirmed and expanded upon Laut's findings. They unearthed more baskets, more tools, and more evidence of the daily lives of the cave's inhabitants. They found caches of carefully stored seeds, suggesting the cave was used for food storage. They found quids, wads of chewed tule fiber that had been spat out, giving a very personal glimpse into the diet and habits of the ancient people. Harrington's work established a clear timeline, showing that the cave had been in use from around 2500 BC all the way up to the mid-19th century. He was able to distinguish between the earlier Lovelock culture and the later Paiute culture that succeeded it. The archaeological record showed a story of cultural succession, of one group replacing another over a vast span of time. It was during this second, more scientific excavation that the most controversial and mysterious finds were officially documented. Buried deep within the layers of the cave, Harrington's team uncovered more human remains: skeletons, loose bones, and most importantly, skulls. And it is here, in the dry academic language of archaeological field notes and the more sensationalized accounts that followed, that the legend of the giants finds its most potent physical evidence. The central claim is that some of the skeletons unearthed were of a truly gigantic stature. While the initial reports from the guano miners in 1911 were anecdotal and prone to exaggeration, the story was given a veneer of legitimacy by the presence of university-trained archaeologists. Both Laut and Harrington noted in their field reports that some of the skeletal remains were of individuals who were unusually tall for the prehistoric period. While specific, verifiable measurements of complete skeletons are frustratingly scarce in the official records, accounts from the time persistently mention skeletons in the 6.5 to 7 foot range. One particularly famous, though unverified, story tells of a single large male skeleton that was measured in situ and was said to be nearly 8 feet long. Another account, written by John T. Reed, the Paiute who worked with Harrington, claimed that a mummy of a giant man was found, wrapped in a finely woven blanket. The skulls were another source of intense speculation. Several skulls were recovered that were described as being unusually large, with heavy brow ridges and massive, powerful jawbones. These were not the delicate features typical of the local Paiute population. They seemed to represent a different, more robust physical type. Did these large skulls and tall skeletons belong to the Sitech of legend? For those who wanted to believe, this was the smoking gun. It was physical, tangible proof, dug from the very cave where the final battle was said to have taken place. Adding fuel to the fire was the discovery of actual human hair. In the incredibly dry environment of the cave, not only bones but also soft tissues like hair were preserved. And just as the miners had reported, and just as the legend described, clumps of hair were found that were distinctly reddish-brown in color. The archaeologists had found red hair at the site of the legendary last stand of the red-haired giants. The convergence of the oral tradition and the physical evidence was almost too perfect, too compelling to be a coincidence. The archaeological discovery at Lovelock Cave had not debunked the Paiute legend. In many ways, it seemed to have proven it true. The cave was not just an ancient habitation site. It was a crime scene, the final resting place of a mysterious and vanquished race. The academic world had stumbled upon a story that was far stranger and more profound than they could have ever imagined. But this is where the mystery only deepens, because the most crucial evidence in this entire story, the giant bones and skulls themselves, would soon become almost as legendary and elusive as the Sitech themselves. We have now arrived at the heart of the enigma, the place where the ancient, flowing river of myth crashes against the hard, unyielding shoreline of reality. On one side, we have the powerful, consistent oral tradition of the Paiute people, a story passed down for generations about a war against a race of red-haired, cannibalistic giants called the Sitech, which ended in a fiery battle at a specific cave. On the other side, we have the archaeological record, the documented excavation of that very same cave, Lovelock Cave, which unearthed thousands of artifacts and, most importantly, unusual human remains that seemed, at first glance, to confirm the legend. The discovery of tall skeletons and reddish hair in the fabled tomb of the red-haired giants feels like the final satisfying chapter of a great mystery solved. It's the moment where the legend becomes history. But this is where the story gets complicated, where the clean lines between myth and fact begin to blur and break apart. The collision of these two worlds did not result in a clear, unified picture. Instead, it created a fog of controversy, a swirl of competing explanations, and a host of new, even deeper mysteries. To navigate this fog, we must act as detectives, taking each piece of seemingly conclusive evidence and placing it under a microscope. We must compare the sensational claims to the sober scientific explanations, and in doing so we will uncover a story of missing evidence, academic debate, and wild conspiracy theories that keep the legend of the Lovelock giants alive and roaring to this day. Let's begin with the most sensational and central claim of the entire mystery: the discovery of giant skeletons. This is the cornerstone of the legend's claim to reality. If the Sitech were real, they must have been giants, and their bones must have been found in the cave. The stories that have circulated for over a century are tantalizingly specific. The early guano miners, men like James Hart and David Pugh, gave vivid, informal accounts of what they found. They spoke of unearthing skeletons that were, in their words, gigantic. They told tales of finding jawbones so large that a modern man could slip one over his own face, and of leg bones that were far longer than their own. These were not scientific measurements, but they were powerful first-hand accounts that captured the public imagination. Later, these anecdotal reports were seemingly bolstered by more credible sources. Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, a prominent Paiute author and activist writing in the late 19th century, before the official excavations, documented her people's traditions and described the giants as being tall. After the university excavations began, the stories became even more specific. Local newspapers at the time ran sensational headlines about the discovery of a lost race of giants in Nevada. Settlers and amateur historians who visited the site or spoke with the excavators passed on stories of skeletons measuring 7, 8, or even 9 feet in length. One of the most persistent tales involves a specific, nearly complete male skeleton that was allegedly measured by multiple people before it was removed from the cave, with its height pegged at a staggering 8.5 feet. Another story, told by the Paiute worker John T. Reed, describes the unearthing of a mummified man who was gorgeously robed and of a giant stature. These accounts painted a clear picture. Lovelock Cave was a tomb filled with the remains of beings who were far larger than any known human population. If these reports are true, they would force a complete rewriting of North American prehistory. But this is where the scientific explanation throws a large bucket of cold water on the fiery legend. When we turn away from the newspaper clippings and local hearsay and look at the official published academic reports from L.L. Loud and M.R. Harrington, the word giant is conspicuously absent. These were trained scientists, and their job was to measure and document, not to sensationalize. Their field notes and publications describe the human remains with professional detachment. They do note finding skeletons that were robust and tall, particularly in the earlier layers of the cave. But their measurements, when they are available, do not support the existence of 8-foot giants. Modern anthropologists who have re-examined the Lovelock collection and the original field notes have come to a more sober conclusion. The people of the Lovelock culture, who predated the Paiute in the region, were indeed a tall and hardy people. Some of the male skeletons likely belonged to individuals who stood between 6 feet and perhaps 6.5 feet tall. In a prehistoric context, this is exceptionally tall. The average height of people around the world at that time was significantly shorter than it is today. Furthermore, the neighboring Paiute people were, on average, of a smaller stature. To a person who is 5 feet 4 inches tall, an individual who is 6 feet 5 inches tall would indeed appear to be a giant. Their size would be intimidating, their strength formidable. It's entirely plausible that the Paiute oral tradition, passed down over thousands of years, remembered these tall, rival people as literal giants, with their height becoming more exaggerated with each generation of storytelling. The legend in this view is not a lie but a folk memory, a piece of historical truth seen through the magnifying glass of myth. The giants were real, but they were not a separate, monstrous race. They were just very tall humans. This explanation is logical and scientifically sound, but it doesn't satisfy those who are convinced by the eyewitness accounts. What about that 8.5-foot skeleton? What about the jawbones a man could wear as a mask? The scientific record is silent on these specific sensational finds, which leads to the frustrating heart of the matter. If they were real, where are they now? This question leads us directly into the second great pillar of the controversy. Let's move on to that other shocking piece of physical evidence, the red hair. The Paiute legend is incredibly specific on this point. The Cth were not just giants, they were red-haired giants. This detail is so unusual, so contrary to the uniform black hair of Native American populations, that it seems like a specific, observed fact. And then during the excavations, both the miners and the university archaeologists found exactly that. Clumps and braids of human hair that were, without a doubt, a distinct reddish-brown color. This seems, on the surface, to be irrefutable proof. How could the Paiute have invented a detail like red hair, only for archaeologists to find it in the very same cave 2,000 years later? It feels like a one-in-a-million coincidence, a direct hit that validates the entire oral tradition. For believers in the legend, the red hair is proof that the Cth were a different race entirely. They were not Native Americans. Theories abound as to their origin. Perhaps they were the descendants of an ancient European or Celtic group who had made their way to America thousands of years before Columbus, a lost clan of red men from across the sea. Perhaps they were something even more ancient, a remnant of a pre-Ice Age civilization, a surviving pocket of a lost race that once spanned the globe. The red hair is seen as a genetic marker, a clear sign that these were not the ancestors of the Paiute, but an alien and invasive people who were eventually wiped out. The discovery of the hair, therefore, is not just a curious detail. It is the key to a secret history of pre-Columbian America. Once again, however, science offers a much less romantic, but far more plausible explanation. The phenomenon of ancient black hair turning red or brown over time is well documented by archaeologists and forensic scientists all over the world. It's a process called taphonomy, the study of what happens to an organism after it dies. The color of human hair is determined by pigments, primarily a type called melanin. Black hair is rich in a specific type of melanin called eumelanin. Over long periods of burial, the chemical environment of the soil, the humidity, and the gradual decay of organic tissues can alter the chemical structure of this pigment. The stable black eumelanin can slowly break down and denature, leaving behind the more stable red-brown pigment, pheomelanin, or simply changing color through chemical reactions. This process can turn the blackest hair into a shade of auburn or reddish-brown. This phenomenon has been observed in Egyptian mummies, in ancient bog bodies found in Europe, and in remains from archaeological sites across the Americas. It is a common and expected result of long-term burial in certain conditions. The incredibly dry, alkaline environment of Lovelock Cave, combined with the chemicals present in the bat guano, would have created the perfect conditions for this color change to occur. So the archaeologists did find red hair. But it was almost certainly not from people who had red hair in life. It was the ancient black hair of the cave's inhabitants that had changed color over the centuries. The Paiute legend, in this scientific view, presents a fascinating puzzle. How did they know about the red hair? Perhaps the legend originated much later, after some of the remains in the cave had already been disturbed by animals or erosion, exposing the strangely colored hair and giving rise to a story to explain it. Or perhaps by a strange twist of fate, the legend and the natural chemical process arrived at the same conclusion independently. Either way, science tells us that the red hair is not proof of a lost European race, but rather a predictable artifact of time and chemistry. The scientific explanations for the height and the hair color are rational and well supported. For most mainstream archaeologists, they are enough to close the case. The Lovelock Cave giants were simply tall people of the Lovelock culture, and their hair turned red after they were buried. The Paiute legend is a fascinating but mythologized memory of an ancient conflict between two different native groups. But this neat and tidy conclusion leaves many people deeply unsatisfied. Doesn't feel right. It doesn't account for the intensity of the eyewitness reports from the miners. And most importantly, it dances around the single biggest and most frustrating question in this entire saga. What happened to the evidence? This is where the story moves from academic debate into the realm of modern myth and conspiracy. This is the ultimate mystery of Lovelock Cave. If the guano miners really did find an 8-foot-tall skeleton, where is it? If Harrington's team really did unearth massive, unusual skulls, where are they now? The artifacts from Lovelock Cave were sent to several different institutions. The bulk of L.L. Loud's collection went to the University of California's Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology. Other items ended up at the Museum of the American Indian in New York, which later became part of the Smithsonian. However, when researchers today go looking for the most spectacular giant remains in these collections, they are met with a frustrating silence. The collections contain thousands of artifacts, baskets, tools, decoys, and they do contain human remains from the site. But the definitive, oversized skeletons and skulls, the very evidence that would prove the legend true, are missing. This missing evidence is the fuel that powers the modern Lovelock giant conspiracy theory. The narrative is simple and powerful. The giant skeletons were found, but they were deliberately confiscated and hidden by the scientific establishment. The primary target of this theory is usually the Smithsonian Institution. The claim is that the Smithsonian, as the gatekeeper of official American history, has a vested interest in maintaining the mainstream narrative of human evolution and settlement in the Americas. The existence of a race of 8 or 9 foot tall giants would shatter that narrative. It would open the door to uncomfortable questions about human origins, about alternative evolutionary paths, and about the very history told in our textbooks. Therefore, the theory goes, whenever such anomalous remains are found not just at Lovelock, but at other sites across America, agents from the Smithsonian quietly arrive, confiscate the evidence, and make it disappear into a vast secret warehouse, never to be seen again. The scientists, it is claimed, are engaged in a systematic, century-long cover-up to protect their dogmatic view of history from any evidence that contradicts it. This theory is, of course, almost impossible to prove or disprove. The Smithsonian categorically denies that it is hiding giant skeletons. They maintain that no such remains were ever accessioned into their collections from Lovelock Cave. But for believers, this denial is just part of the cover-up. The very absence of evidence becomes, paradoxically, the proof of the conspiracy. The bones are missing because they were so important. This creates a self-sealing argument that is impervious to scientific rebuttal. From this core conspiracy, even more elaborate and fantastical theories have blossomed. Some researchers and authors connect the Lovelock giants to a global phenomenon, linking them to the biblical story of the Nephilim. In the book of Genesis, the Nephilim are described as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, and they were said to be giants in the earth in those days. Proponents of this theory suggest that the Cetaceae were not just tall humans, but a remnant of this semi-divine hybrid race. They see Lovelock Cave as one of the last battlegrounds in a secret, global war between humanity and the last of the Nephilim, a war whose history has been deliberately erased from our official records. Others take a more extraterrestrial approach, suggesting that the giants were a stranded alien race, or the result of ancient genetic engineering by extraterrestrial visitors. The strange features, the height, the red hair, the supposed strength, are seen as markers of a non-human origin. The story of Lovelock Cave is woven into the broader tapestry of ancient astronaut theories, becoming another piece of evidence that humanity's past is far stranger than we are led to believe. So where does that leave us? On one side, we have a clear, rational scientific explanation that accounts for most of the facts, albeit in a way that strips the story of its magic. On the other, we have a powerful legend, supported by tantalizing eyewitness accounts and fueled by a deep-seated distrust of official institutions, and a compelling mystery of missing evidence. The truth of Lovelock Cave likely lies somewhere in the murky space between these two extremes. It's possible that the guano miners did find some unusually large skeletons that were subsequently lost or discarded before they could be properly studied. It's possible that the truth has been muddied by a century of exaggerations, rumors, and outright hoaxes. What we are left with is a story that refuses to be neatly resolved. It is a perfect storm of ancient folklore, genuine archaeological discovery, sensational journalism, and modern conspiracy. The legend of the Lovelock Giants endures not because the evidence is conclusive, but because it is so frustratingly incomplete. The missing bones have created a vacuum, and into that vacuum, our human need for wonder, mystery, and a history grander than the one we've been told has rushed in. The cave has given up thousands of its secrets, but it seems determined to hold on to its most important one. And as long as those giant skeletons remain missing, the question will linger in the desert air. Was Lovelock Cave the site of a simple tribal conflict, or was it the final tomb of the last American giants? The story of Lovelock Cave sits on a razor's edge between folklore and fact. While science offers plausible explanations for the red hair and the tall skeletons, the legend's power endures. The lost artifacts and the vivid Paiute tradition leave us to wonder. Perhaps some myths are not just stories, but the distorted echoes of a real, forgotten history slumbering beneath the earth. If the past still whispers to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Ancient Relics Keeper, because some mysteries were never meant to be buried.